Come up here.
The previous topic was literally very pleasant. My topic is less enjoyable but equally important. So I would like to talk to you about refugee connectivity. And one way of starting that is to say that I believe in a concept of dharma, which is a sense of mission, like a purpose of being here and what we're meant to do in our lives. And it looks like mine is linked to telecommunications, because my family's been doing this for almost 100 years. My grandfather was a telegraph operator with the Brazilian Navy in the 1920s. Then he was the founder of the first news radio in Rio de Janeiro in 1935. Did that his whole life. My father was a pioneer in the TV broadcasting industry, and I've been doing this my whole career. So what I'm focusing on right now in terms of giving continuity to that tradition is a member of the United Nations group of experts in public-private partnerships for smart cities. And as part of that group, which is based between Geneva and Barcelona, we try to identify good practices and frameworks that are being deployed worldwide and simplifying, adapting them so that they can be used all over the world. And smart cities is a very big topic. Tomorrow we'll be talking about that, and we'll have an opportunity to get into more detail. But part of the work that we do with the United Nations is giving the poorest nations and member states an opportunity to have the same advantages that the wealthier countries have, because they can invest and fail until they manage to succeed. And that basically leads to a personal aspect of what I'm trying to achieve while I'm around. And that is a deep belief that connectivity is a human right. It's not official, it's not something that has been approved, but I believe that we all here understand what it means to be connected, and above all, when you lose that connection, how it feels, you know, the sense of powerlessness. And based on that, I have a dream of bringing affordable Wi-Fi connectivity to as many people as possible in vulnerable communities. They can be Indian tribes in Amazon, they can be refugees in camps or slums with a high concentration of refugees. And they would also be within the United Nations categorization, parts of a group called OHRLLS, which is a mouthful, as usually is the case with the United Nations, but it basically means the least developed countries, the landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. There are 92 of them with 1.4 billion people. And these people need help because they don't have large populations, they're isolated, they don't have the sophistication that larger nations have, and that's what I'm aiming to do. Specifically in the case of refugees, to better understand what they're going through, early on this year in February, I spent a week as a refugee, so I flew to the Syrian border and crossed the whole of Turkey, following the route all the way to the Greek island of Lesbos, and had lots of interesting occurrences and experiences. But before we get to that, I'd like to take you to Vienna last summer. Now, Vienna was on the path of the almost million refugees that went through that route further north to places like Germany and Sweden, and they had 3,700 people arriving the same day. You know, it's a very sophisticated city. It's in fact the best place in the world to live in, but they're not used to having this kind of inflow. And they had an issue when they set up the city's cycling stadium as a place to host all these people with the minimum necessities. But there was one concern that they were not expecting. You know, they had an urgent need that absolutely had to be solved, and that was to connect the refugees to the Wi-Fi. Now, this story comes from a colleague of mine who was also a panelist in a Wi-Fi conference last year. He was telling me this, that one Saturday he gets a phone call from the Vienna police saying, could you please come to the stadium tomorrow and install Wi-Fi to 8,000 people? And I think it's reasonable that he replied saying, you knew that these people were coming, why are you calling me today to install it tomorrow? And the answer is that they were not expecting Wi-Fi to be so relevant. So they had shelter, they had food, they had everything they expected the refugees to need to stay there for a few days before they will continue on their journey. But the refugees refused to stay there because there was no Wi-Fi. They'd rather sleep on the street to be able to get connected in bars and other places where they could get a free Wi-Fi connectivity. So you're in the kind of situation where this becomes extremely important to an extent that we can't even conceive, because they have a smartphone, which is their lifeline. They left everything else behind. They sold everything they had to be able to pay for the smugglers to get all the way to Vienna. So that smartphone is basically useless when it's not connected. And it serves to keep close to the family, to plan the next steps on the journey, to basically everything that makes them feel safe. Which is why I would like to ask you, and please raise your hand if you've heard of the Maslow pyramid category of needs. Yep. Quite a few people. If you haven't heard about that, I suggest you look it up, because it's a very interesting and very useful concept. I have a hypothesis to offer you. The version 1.0 is useful enough the way it is. I believe there is a new version which has connectivity at the bottom. Now, this has circulated on the internet as a joke for quite some time, saying, oh, below Wi-Fi you have battery life because it's so important. But you see, in the case of the refugees arriving in Vienna, that was the case. They refused to cater to their physiological needs because connectivity was so relevant. They were leaving that stadium where they had shelter to go somewhere where they could be connected because it was more important than the kind of situation they were in. So this is a hypothesis, and I believe that considering that's the situation that they're facing, let's continue our journey from Vienna to a far less pleasant place, which is Syria. And I'm not here to tell you what you heard from the media, all the bad news and the politics behind and the visible and hidden actors. I'm here to share with you some elements that you may not be aware of that explain the dynamics of what's happening, why the refugees are coming massively to Europe. At least they were coming before there was a deal signed with Turkey, which may not be very long-lasting considering the latest discussions between Turkey and the EU. But there was one thing that shocked me when I read about it, and it does make a lot of sense, is that this war is different. There are way too many actors involved. And you have journalists from the New York Times saying, this is not going to end. It's just too convoluted, it's too complicated, and it's not going to get any better. And people coming from Syria and Iraq and the greater region, they understand that. And this is why they're leaving, because they are feeling that they have no options. And those who can sell something and pay the smugglers to come to Europe, they're trying to do that because they have no better choice. Now, a way of summarizing that is saying that they migrate to Europe because they want to establish a new life. It doesn't necessarily mean that they want to do it, because when they migrate, usually one or two members of the family can do that, so they're dividing their families. They have no idea if they're ever going to be reunited again, and they do that out of desperation. And that desperation is basically leaving hell to seek hope. So you are in the kind of context, and 2015 was a terrible year for that. I had more than 1 million people coming from that region and other regions. I'm focusing on that specific aspect because it's the most visible one. But they're leaving hell seeking hope. Now, there are quite a few of them trying to do that. 1 million Syrians already asked for asylum status. But let's keep in mind that before the war, there are 21 million Syrians. This is not going to stop anytime soon. We have this stopgap measure with Turkey keeping them in the country and making it harder for them to come across, but the pressure will mount and they'll keep on trying to find solutions. So I would like to make a proposition, and that is basically, let's change the equation and export hope back to the region. Let's give them options that would allow them to have dignified lives and would reduce this pressure to migrate to Europe. They don't really want to come here in most cases. They just want to make sure that they have the option of staying there and having decent lives, whatever it means in a very difficult context, which is what they're living in at the moment. So the idea of exporting hope would focus in that specific case in the 5 major hosting countries. So you have in the order of number of refugees that are being hosted, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Egypt. And let's see what we can do to help improve the situation. Now, just a parenthesis here. Lots of people say, oh yeah, no, it's a tough problem, but I'm busy. I have to pick up my kids at school and take them to sports, and what can I do anyway? The one thing that people don't realize is that there's a Geneva Convention on Human Rights, which is very well known. But there's another Geneva Convention, one signed in 1951 by 147 countries. And there it's clearly stated that we have to help as member states, unless they want to become lecherous rogue states and they would rescind their obligations, which hopefully they eventually learn that is not a very good idea. But this is a shared global responsibility. If you have people fleeing a war zone and they risk their lives by staying there, other countries have to take care of them. This has been signed 65 years ago. And the flow, the volume now makes it really hard, but we just have to be more creative and open-minded in terms of how we're going to be solving this problem. Reducing the flow, trying to get more people involved in different ways, and there are many efforts that are being going on recently, and it's a lot better than it would have been if we didn't have the right people involved. But there is a situation where world governments will meet in Geneva and they make pledges. They say, well, I'll take X thousand refugees and I'll give you that much money. That process is very, very slow. It's basically the way the United Nations is built, because you have 193 member states and they all have to come to conclusions that are mutually agreed. So it is slow by design, but it's there for a reason. And that is one of the biggest problems we're facing right now. But keep in mind that the Syrian crisis started, in fact, before the war, when millions of Syrian peasants from the small villages, they went to the big towns because they had a climate change-related drought. It was killing 80% of the livestock. So if you keep on having climate change challenges in the future, you have more and more refugees. So we have to get better at doing this. And we have to keep an open mind in terms of what is the solution to the problem, which is what startups are so good at doing, coming up with novel solutions to big problems. Now, I have a demonstration here. It's basically showing you what a refugee camp looks like. As you see those pictures of the kids and the tents and everything else, but Zaatari is a camp in Jordan, which used to be the second largest, now is the third largest, and is the size of a small town, like 85,000 people. These people are like an extreme case of a least developed country, because they have all the poverty and the trouble and no sovereignty. They can't raise taxes, they can't do anything else. They just have, receive help, and they can only provide feedback and hope that someone is going to listen. And when you look at a picture of Zaatari from above, it kind of looks like a town, right, in a city in the desert, because you have a city center, you have the different districts, but it's not built to be a city. It's not built to be a permanent settlement, because people are supposed to get there, stay for a couple of months, have their cases processed, and then either get resettled, sent back to the place of origin, or find another solution. This is not happening because of the way the system is designed. So we should look into ways of making those camps, or not necessarily camps, because only 9% of the refugees in Jordan, they stay in the camps, because there's nothing for them to do there. They go to slums in cities, and there are areas with high concentration of refugees that have exactly the same kind of problem. Lots of people without a future, and no work permits either, because local governments are afraid that they're going to be stealing jobs from the local citizens. So it's a stalemate wherever they go, with very few exceptions. So basically, you look at the camp today, and you try to understand that, assume that this person's gone there, and they're told they have to wait. Now, after 6 years of war, question for all of you, what is the percentage of refugees that you think in that region have been resettled permanently? So they have the paperwork, they can work in whichever country has received them. Raise your hand if you think it's more than 20%. More than 10? Yeah, so the figure is 3.6. So this is after 6 years. So they arrived there and they're told you have to wait. 6 years later, 3.6% have found a solution. And settlements and resettlements, they're not the only solution, but in their current situation, it seems to be the most adequate one, because it's not looking very likely that these people are ever going back. The refugees who go to Kurdistan from Syria and Iraq, they clearly state that they're not going back. And when I mean Iraq, I mean Kurdistan is part of Iraq, but it's a safe region in Iraq. So they prefer to resettle there, and we have to help them in that process. Now, the official figures vary, but you ask someone at the UNHCR, the UN Agency for Refugees, what's the average waiting time? They can't answer because it's too politicized. But everybody uses 17 years as an average waiting time, where you're basically sitting in a tent in a desert waiting for something to happen. Now, this is something that we could try to address. It has to be done in a very structured manner and respect to the local limitations of the countries, because they have very justifiable concerns with security. If you connect these people, what are they going to do with that connection? Are they going to be attacking us and everything else? And are they going to be taking jobs from the local population? All of those things, they have to be clearly defined, and we need to make sure that everybody involved is comfortable with the process. But this is the one thing that we could potentially do. Now, we have Wi-Fi here in Riga. In fact, it's considered a Wi-Fi capital, and you understand the value of that. But you have your 3G, 4G connection. For 25 euros, you can have unlimited data. So you have options. These people have basically zero options because they have close to zero revenue, and there's no infrastructure per se. So if we manage to install the same kind of Wi-Fi I have here, so professional grade equipment, and we manage to bring affordable connectivity, and affordability is clearly defined by the United Nations as up to 5% of your monthly income, which in a refugee camp is pretty much 5% of zero. And we have to consider that as the equation we're trying to solve. But although this is actually quite expensive to do in a normal city, each hotspot costs $2,000 just to have the hardware, and then you have to install it and maintain it and everything else. There are options if you think creatively. So one of the ideas is to ask big telecommunication operators in wealthier countries to donate old equipment that they're no longer using, because they replaced the first generation with something newer and fancier. And they have this equipment sitting there that they can actually give to charitable contexts such as a refugee camp. We can ask engineers all over the world to do pro bono work, to come and help with the configuration and the maintenance of the system. We can ask people to donate bandwidth and negotiate deals with satellite operators to have subsidized prices. There are lots of things that can be done to make this a reality. And that's what I'm trying to achieve. So if you connect these people, what happens then is that you allowing them to find micro work, things like data entry that they can do in the phones of small PCs, training artificial intelligence servers to say, okay, this looks like a tree, yes, no. You need a human brain for that, and you need an affordable human brain, because you have to do it many, many times for the AI to be trained. And I believe that they are in a position where if you give them this option, they're going to be generating this revenue. The local governments can tax this revenue, because in fact this is money coming into the country, even though the work is being done elsewhere, and everybody can win. And we have to do that in an affordable manner so that it can be replicated in as many camps as possible. I'm using the Syrian case, but this is valid to refugees all over the world. Today, close to 1% of the world population are either refugees, meaning they left their country of origin, or they're internally displaced, meaning that they left their homes, but they're still within the country. That's 65 million people. 1% of the world population could benefit from this kind of solution. These are brains that are being wasted. They're just sitting there waiting for 17 years and longer in some cases. So to come to the conclusion, I believe that we should be creative and open-minded when we look at this kind of situation. So it's not necessarily the old methods that are going to solve a much larger problem that we're facing today. I believe we should export hope back to the region so that everybody benefits from what they're seeking when they come here. And I believe they should reconnect these forgotten souls and bring them back to humanity so that we can all share our common destiny in more equal terms and allow them to have dignified lives. Thank you for your time.
And I know she'll be the death of me, at least.